red blood cell metabolism then. You get the BPG, and again, that changes the affinity of the hemoglobin for oxygen, promotes oxygen unloading. We put it all together then, when the blood is coursing through actively metabolizing tissues. What are they doing? They're producing CO2, which increases the partial pressure of CO2 in the area. The CO2 mixes with the water, that increases the acidity. You get carbonic acid, increase the hydrogen levels. That also promotes unloading. And, of course, they're active metabolizing. What are they doing? They're generating heat. Also promotes oxygen loading. So when the blood is coursing through more actively metabolizing tissues, this promotes oxygen unloading. If the tissues are less metabolically active, they're going to be cooler, less CO2 is given off, less acidity, and there's less oxygen unloading. So you put it together, it makes some sense. Any questions? Okay, let's look at CO2 transport. I already know that most of the oxygen in the blood is carried chemically bound to hemoglobin, the red blood cells, but that's not true for CO2 because carbon dioxide is more soluble in water than is oxygen. So there are three forms in which the CO2 is transported, but most of it is outside the red blood cells. You can see only about 20 to 30% of the carbon dioxide is transported in the red blood cells, chemically bound to hemoglobin. It binds not to the heme groups in the hemoglobin, but to the amino acids, the globin part, or protein portion of the hemoglobin. So they combine the different parts, the CO2 and the oxygen. So the same molecule carries both CO2 and oxygen. You can see that's only a small amount, about 20 to 30%. Most, by far the majority, of the carbon dioxide is carried in the plasma, but not as carbon dioxide, but rather as bicarbonate ions, which are HCO3, which are base ions. Because again, when you have CO2 mixed with water, it forms carbonic acid, it gives off hydrogens and bicarbonate ions. So about 60 to 70% of the carbon dioxide is formed as bicarbonate ions and carried in the plasma in that form. There is a small amount of CO2 dissolved in the plasma as gas. It's only about 7 to 10%. But if we put it all together, outside the cells, you can see you can have maybe up to 80% of the CO2 carried outside the cells in the plasma, and maybe only as little as 20% or so actually carried in the red blood cells. Again, it has to do with solubility of CO2 in water, and of course the plasma of that is mostly dry. Any questions on this? Okay, let's take a brief look now at acid-base imbalances. And we'll revisit this again later in the semester when we talk about acid-base balance, fluid electrolyte balance as well. Okay, first off, a condition known as acidosis or acidemia. This is a condition in which the pH of the extracellular fluid is lower than normal. It's too acidic. And notice that in the blood, this would be below pH 735. In fact, the blood pH is between 735 and 745. That's the normal range. Remember on the pH scale, it's a logarithmic scale. It goes from 0 to 14. The middle scale, of course, is 7. That would be neutral, neither acid nor base. As you go above 7 and approach 14, you get increasingly basic or alkaline, which means the hydrogen concentration is decreasing and hydroxide ion levels are increasing. Hydroxide ions are base ions. Below 7, then, you're becoming, as you approach 0, you're becoming increasingly more acidic, hydrogen ion concentration increasing, and hydroxide or base ion concentration decreasing. So you can see, we're talking about slightly basic conditions here. But below 735, you go into acidosis. And one form of acidosis is called respiratory acidosis. And this is the result of hypoventilation. In other words, any condition that interferes with breathing, taking air in and out of the lungs, or gas exchange in the lungs. Here, what happens with the CO2 generation exceeds its excretion of lungs. You build up high levels of carbonic acid, and the result is you decrease the pH. It becomes increasingly more acidic. What can cause hypoventilation? Hypoventilation can be due, obviously, to diseases affecting the lungs, like emphysema, cystic fibrosis, chronic bronchitis, pulmonary edema. What happens in emphysema? A lot of people who are smokers end up with emphysema. What's actually happening? Why are they hauling around a portable oxygen generator or maybe even an oxygen tank?
Their alveoli, they don't work or diffuse.
Well, what happens is you break down the alveolar walls, you have less area for gas exchange. So instead of having a lot of alveoli, you have fewer and fewer alveoli, less surface for gas exchange, and you don't aerate the blood as well. That's why you have to have a high oxygen content in the air you breathe. That's why we're on these generators. If you're a smoker, that's something you can look forward to, very likely. Emphysema. But if you're a smoker, you should quit ASAP. Yes?
Is there a certain level, like when a person starts smoking, that their lung can repair itself?
Is it what?
Is there a certain level of like repair that can occur if a person is,
Well, it depends on the person. You say, well, my great grandfather would smoke all his life. No. That's about the way it is. Okay. And he lived to be 96. All right. So I wouldn't even say that. There are probably 10 or 100 that die much younger than they should because of respiratory diseases as a result of smoking. But yeah, it depends on when you start, how much you smoke, obviously, and it varies from person to person. So you can't really say. You know. But the sooner, if you're a smoker, the sooner you smoke, the better your chances of repair. Yes.
So it can repair itself, like if the alveoli are damaged?
It can. Well, not in the advanced stage of emphysema.
But if it was an early?
Yeah, if you're starting to go into that, I mean, usually it starts with chronic bronchitis. So like I say, if you stop soon enough, you're going to be somewhere. Yes.
I was about to say, an example of that is the course I took last semester. She quit after 2 or 3 years, and now she's a whole lot better than when she started. Like before she just had trouble breathing, but now it's about like 80%. It's not going to ever be the way it was.
It'll never be completely. You know,
But it's got,
never smoked,
it's
but it gets
improved.
better.
But that was also 2 or 3 years that she was smoking.
Yeah, so there's a pronounced change in a relatively short period of time. Yes.
Almost like an intense smoking.
That's it's not as bad, but it's also bad. So it's better, you know, if you're, especially in a confined environment. Here's not quite so bad. I lived in the north for many years, and the winters up there, you can't drive around your windows open when it's 20 below zero. So you're in a confined environment, and somebody's pumping away, and pretty soon your eyes are going over dirty. So I am a big smoker. That's one thing that I was not going to smoke. And that just, you know, it was hard. It was hard breathing. That was just secondary smoke. Yeah.
would you say that in that, I guess in the stage of beginning to repair, like working out, like respiratory exercises, would that
It helps, yeah. Exercise is always good. It's good for your lungs, good for your heart, all your organs. It increases circulation. Okay, so that's emphysema. And again, it's breaking down of the alveolar walls, you have less and less surface area for gas exchange. And again, most common cause of emphysema? Smoking. Okay, cystic fibrosis. This is a genetic disease. It's inherited. As you may know, it results in an overproduction of mucus, which basically, of course, interferes with gas exchange in the lungs. It also interferes with nutrient absorption because it clogs the GI tract as well. Very nasty disease. And children have that basically suffer terribly because you're trying to clear the respiratory and GI tract passages. So that also can cause hypoventilation. Also, anything that basically shuts down or depresses the respiratory centers in the brain. This can be due to a drug overdose, okay? It can be due to trauma to the brain as well. Anything that obstructs the airway, obviously, can also cause hypoventilation. And if there's paralysis or damage to respiratory muscles, again, we're talking about the diaphragm, intercostal muscles, things like that. If you paralyze them, basically you can't breathe. Or if you damage them, it makes it very difficult to breathe. All this can bring on hypoventilation, the result in is usually respiratory acidosis. Again, pH less than 7.35, but we're still here slightly basic. What's the main effect? The main effect we see is on the central nervous system. What happens is you get depression of the central nervous system by inhibiting the synaptic transmission. If that blood pH reaches 7, now we're at neutral. Now you have severe depression of the central nervous system. This results basically in, first of all, neurological symptoms like disorientation, get dizzy, eventually lapse into unconsciousness, coma, and if it's not corrected, death. This is at neutral pH. Like I say, small change in pH can have a drastic effect on the body. And that's why it's so important that we maintain a fairly stable, narrow pH range in our body fluids. That's acid-base balance. And we have ways of doing that, which we'll talk about later. We'll talk about acid-base balance later. Okay, the other condition is alkalosis or alkalemia. Now the pH is too high. In this case, the pH in the blood, for example, would be above 7.45.